March 7, 1945. The sky over Germany was a frozen battlefield made of vapor and fear. At 30,000 feet, Lieutenant Dale Heston's P-47 Thunderbolt clawed through the thin air, its silver fuselage vibrating with the kind of strain that ripped engines apart. Behind him, a streak of silver lightning closed the gap, a German Me-262 jet. The sound was different, not a growl like a piston, but a banshee's scream. The first combat jet in history was hunting the heaviest single-seat fighter the U.S. had ever built. Heston glanced over his shoulder. The 262 was coming fast, the distance shrinking from 800 yards to 500 in seconds. The manuals said not to run. A jet can outrun, outclimb, and outgun you. He could almost hear his instructor's voice. Don't chase the future. It's faster than you. But on that day, the future was chasing him. He pushed the throttle forward until the lever hit its stop. The manifold pressure gauge spun past its red line, 52 inches, then 54, 56. The needle should have stuck. The engine should have seized. But it didn't. The jug roared like something alive. The turbocharger howled with a strange new pitch, the exhaust stacks glowing cherry red. The airspeed needle trembled. 520 mph, 540, then past 560. The German jet closed for the kill. Its cannons flashed once, missed. The P-47 dove slightly, then climbed, its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine screaming in fury. The impossible was happening. A piston-driven fighter was accelerating faster than a jet. The Me-262's pilot overcorrected, startled. His jet overshot, its thin wings shuddering from turbulence. Heston rolled inverted, kicked hard on the rudder, and dove through the contrail of his enemy. For a brief second, the jet hung above him, powerless to turn fast enough. Then it broke off. Silence filled the cockpit except for the tortured whine of the overboosted engine. Heston's breathing steadied. He was alive. Against every law of aerodynamics and common sense, his Thunderbolt had just outrun a machine designed to end its kind. When he landed at the forward strip, the ground crew stared. Smoke poured from the turbo exhaust. The skin around the cowling was scorched black, and the pressure manifold had cracked clean through. A sergeant ran out shouting, "What the hell did you do up there?" Heston just climbed down, eyes wide and distant. "Ask Mac," he said. Arthur Mac McAllister, the quiet, grease-covered mechanic with a habit of breaking rules in the name of physics. The one who had spent nights tinkering with forbidden circuits, muttering about turbo lag and wasted energy. No one believed him when he said he could make a prop plane outrun a jet. Not the brass, not the engineers, not even the pilots who trusted him with their lives. But at 30,000 feet that morning, the laws of the sky bent, not for a jet, but for a man who rewired them. And his name wasn't in any manual. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had begun to whisper a new word that chilled Allied pilots more than flak or fuel fires. Strahljäger, jet fighter. The Me-262 was faster than anything that had ever flown in combat, a machine that turned the very idea of aerial pursuit into a joke. To the men on the ground and in the air, it wasn't an airplane. It was a prophecy. Allied intelligence briefings called it a generational leap. The Me-262 could reach 540 miles per hour, almost 100 faster than the best P-47s or Mustangs. Its twin Junkers, Jumo 004 engines, gave it acceleration that piston pilots couldn't match, and when it dove, it vanished. The manuals were clear. Avoid engagement. Survive to fight another day. But that phrase, survive to fight another day, was a slow death sentence for the men in the sky. Every bomber they escorted was a target. Every dive, every climb, ended with the same blur of silver and a sudden burst of cannon fire. The Me-262 didn't duel. It appeared, killed, and disappeared. In the officer's tent, over black coffee and cold rations, pilots argued about the jet gap. Some believed the war was over, not by surrender, but by speed. You can't outfly physics, one said. They built the future, and we're stuck in the past. Even the engineers at Republic Aviation admitted defeat on paper. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged radial engine was a masterpiece of brute force engineering, but at high altitudes it was like a bodybuilder trying to breathe through a straw. The turbo lag at 30,000 feet could mean a full 2 seconds between throttle input and response, an eternity in combat. To most, the solution was to wait for better machines, jets of their own, still crawling through test flights in the U.S. desert. But waiting wasn't an option for the men flying over Germany. Then there were the mechanics, the ones who didn't have the luxury of theory, the ones who lived ankle-deep in oil and snow, patching bullet holes and praying over cracked turbos. They were told to maintain, not invent. Arthur Mac McAllister had never been good at following rules. When asked about the jet gap, he'd laugh through a mouthful of cigarette smoke. Gap's just another word for an excuse, he'd say. Ain't no machine built by man that can't be made to run faster. His crewmates called him the wire whisperer. He could listen to an engine and tell you which valve was lying. He could fix a misfire with a wrench and a prayer. But when he started talking about overboosting the manifold pressure curve and delaying the bleed valve, the others thought he'd gone mad. One sergeant asked him, "You trying to blow up the plane or fly it?" Mac grinned. "Whichever comes first." Officially, the P-47's manuals forbade touching the turbo governor system. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. The brass said the margin between maximum boost and engine detonation was only a few inches of mercury. But to Mac, that margin wasn't danger. It was opportunity. And in a muddy hangar in France, under flickering lights and silence broken only by the clink of a screwdriver, he began to cross that line. Arthur Mac McAllister wasn't born to be an engineer. He was born to fix what broke, long before he ever heard the words turbo supercharger or altitude compensation. He was a farmhand in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, waking before sunrise to wrestle with frozen tractors and oil-starved generators. His first engine wasn't a Pratt & Whitney. It was a 1931 John Deere that coughed black smoke until he rewired its ignition with barbed wire and a pocket knife. That was Mac's education. Not in classrooms, but in barns, where problems didn't care about blueprints. You learned by listening. You learned by smell. You learned by touch. When a machine coughed, you didn't call an engineer. You became one. In 1942, when the U.S. Army Air Forces called for aviation mechanics, Mac signed up before breakfast. He scored poorly on regulations, but perfectly on diagnostics. One officer wrote on his evaluation, "Intuitive mechanical aptitude, limited respect for authority." By 1944, he was stationed in France with the 366th Fighter Group, the Thunderbolts. Their P-47s were big, loud, and durable, but above 25,000 feet, they were like bulls in thin air. The pilots joked they could climb like a brick and dive like a dream. To Mac, that was unacceptable. "If it flies, it can climb faster," he'd mutter, while wiping oil from his hands. He had a strange way of talking to machines, out loud like they could hear him. "You're choking yourself, you stubborn bastard," he'd say to a turbo inlet, tapping the housing with a wrench. To most, he was half crazy. To the pilots whose lives depended on his work, he was a miracle worker. The Thunderbolt's heart, its massive R2800 double wasp radial engine, fascinated him. 28 cylinders, twin rows, 2,000 horsepower at sea level, but only if the turbo system cooperated. At altitude, power dropped fast. The turbo's wastegate, a valve that bled off excess exhaust pressure, was controlled by a delicate network of sensors and electric relays. If one part failed, the entire system choked. Mac hated that. "It's like teaching a horse to breathe through a straw," he said. "You don't need sensors, you need guts." He began studying the turbo controller's wiring diagrams after hours, tracing the lines with his grease-stained fingers. He realized the Army engineers had built in multiple safety redundancies, too many. The system protected the engine from overboost, but also robbed it of potential power. They built it for reliability, he told his crew chief. But war's not reliable. The chief frowned. You touch that system, you're grounded. Mac shrugged. Only if I get caught. Still, he didn't start with defiance. He started with data. Over 3 weeks, he logged every pilot complaint, cross-referenced it with fuel pressure readings, and discovered a pattern. The turbo lag spike wasn't mechanical. It was electrical. The relay between the altitude compensator and the wastegate actuator lagged by milliseconds. But at 30,000 feet, that delay meant power loss and near stalls. It wasn't a design flaw. It was fear. The engineers afraid of pilots burning their engines. Mac wasn't afraid. He saw something else. Untapped pressure, wasted energy, hidden horsepower waiting behind a governor built by men who'd never flown combat. That was when the idea hit him. A small bypass wire, barely thicker than a pencil lead, could change the delay curve and give the turbo full boost at higher altitude. It would also violate every safety regulation in the Air Force. He smiled anyway. Sometimes, he said, you gotta burn the rule book to make the engine breathe. In the spring of 1944, the Thunderbolt's reputation sat somewhere between legendary and frustrating. Pilots loved its strength, hated its ceiling. It could dive faster than anything on Earth, but once it climbed past 25,000 feet, the P-47 began to suffocate. Every squadron had its own nickname for it. The Flying Brick, the Altitude Cow, the Thunder Slow. The problem wasn't courage or skill. It was airflow. At 30,000 feet, the atmosphere is a thin film of oxygen and frozen nitrogen. Pistons starve, combustion weakens, and fuel atomization goes haywire. A perfectly tuned engine at sea level becomes a gasping, misfiring beast in the stratosphere. The U.S. Army Air Forces knew this. They'd spent millions designing the P-47's secret weapon, a complex, exhaust-driven turbo supercharger mounted behind the cockpit. Its job was to keep the engine breathing when the air got thin. The turbo worked like magic, on paper. But in combat, it stumbled. Data from the 366th Fighter Group painted an ugly picture. Average turbo lag above 25,000 feet, 1.8 seconds, enough to lose a fight. Power output drop, 18% at 30,000 feet, despite full throttle. Fuel flow instability caused engine flameouts in 1 of every 12 high-altitude sorties. Maintenance hours per aircraft, 58 per flight hour, the highest in the U.S. inventory. Pilots were blunt about it. You could outclimb a Messerschmitt, one said, as long as you started a week early. When the Me-262 appeared in the skies over Germany, that weakness turned lethal. The jet could climb 1,200 feet per minute faster and cruise 100 miles per hour quicker than a Thunderbolt. Pilots were ordered to dive away if attacked. Not engage, escape. To engineers, it was physics. To Mac McAllister, it was betrayal. He watched maintenance crews baby the turbo systems, adjusting, calibrating, and retesting sensors that always failed the same way. He knew the truth. The electronics weren't slow. They were scared. The governor was cutting power at 40 inches of manifold pressure, even when the engine could safely take 50 or more. The wasted energy infuriated him. "Whole damn war's about fuel and pressure," he muttered, "and we're throwing both away." He started keeping his own notebook, a black oil-stained ledger filled with field readings. Every test, every flight, every overboost. He discovered that if the bleed valve delay could be stretched by just 0.7 seconds, the turbo would stay in sync with throttle input. The lag would vanish. But there was a reason no one tried it. Heat. Every inch of extra boost meant exhaust temperatures over 1,600 degrees. The turbo housing could crack. The manifold could warp. A P-47 running that hot could become a fireball in the sky. The manual said, "Do not exceed 52 inches manifold pressure for more than 5 minutes. Failure to comply may result in detonation, loss of aircraft, or fatal injury." Mac read that line once, folded the page, and muttered, "5 minutes is all I need." To him, the math of destruction wasn't something to avoid. It was something to use. If he could hold the boost just long enough, but even for a few minutes, a pilot could climb higher faster and maybe survive the next jet interception. That's what war did to men like him. It blurred the line between danger and duty, between following procedure and saving lives. And in the cold spring of 1945, somewhere between physics and defiance, Mac decided to test his own math. The experiment would take one plane, one spool of copper wire, and the nerve to ignore every rule the Air Corps ever wrote. It began in silence, the kind of silence that fills a hangar after midnight when the generators are off and everyone's too tired to argue anymore. A half-burned lantern swayed above the workbench, throwing light over a jungle of copper wiring tools and one open access panel from a P-47 Thunderbolt. Arthur Mac McAllister sat cross-legged on the wing root, cigarette smoldering between his teeth, hands deep inside the guts of a turbo control box. The turbo governor housing was labeled "Do Not Modify" in bold Army stencils. He'd already scraped that off with a knife. Earlier that day, a pilot named Lieutenant Dale Heston had come into the hangar after another failed climb. His voice was ragged. "Mac, I couldn't even reach the bomber altitude without sputtering. Jets showed up. I dove before I ever saw them." Mac looked at him for a long moment, then said the words that would define them both. "You want to live? Then tomorrow we fly my way." That night, he rewired the sky. He started by yanking the turbo governor's feedback relay, a small brass component the engineers called a safety conscience. He bridged two connectors with a copper wire stripped from a broken radio, then soldered a bypass line from the altitude compensator to the pressure manifold feed. What it did was deceptively simple. It delayed the bleed valve response, letting exhaust pressure build far beyond regulation limits. It was the difference between control and chaos. By dawn, his fix was done. A crude toggle switch hidden behind the seat allowed manual override of the turbo bleed-off circuit. If used wrong, the engine could melt in under 60 seconds. If used right, it would make the P-47 breathe like it was still at sea level. When Heston walked in that morning, he saw the scorched table, the burnt wiring, and the glint in Mac's eyes. "You finish it?" Mac nodded. "Don't tell anyone. You flip this switch when you're dying or trying to live forever. Nothing in between." The test flight began at 0700 hours. The ground crew watched as the Silver Thunderbolt taxied to the edge of the strip, its R-2800 coughing clouds of smoke. Mac stood with his arms crossed, a rag slung over his shoulder. "Easy climb to 20,000. Don't touch the toggle until then," he'd told him. At 21,000 feet, Heston called in. "Throttle feels tight. Turbo holding steady. No lag." Mac leaned closer to the radio. "Now flip it." A pause. Then static. Then a sound like thunder cracking through the headset. The engine's tone changed. Deeper, angrier, alive. The boost gauge jumped to 58 inches of mercury. Airspeed climbed fast. 410, 440, 470 mph. The ground crew looked up, shielding their eyes. The P-47 was screaming higher, faster, sharper than any of them had ever seen. Contrails spiraled off the wingtips like comet tails. Heston's voice came through, broken but clear. "Mac, it's holding. It's actually holding." Mac didn't answer right away. He just exhaled, smoke curling from his nose. "Told you she just needed to breathe." At 30,000 feet, the impossible happened. The P-47 leveled off at 562 mph indicated airspeed. That was faster than the official top speed of the Me-262. Heston stayed up there for almost 10 minutes. When he landed, the engine glowed dull red. The manifold casing was cracked, the turbo blades nearly molten. But the plane was still in one piece, and so was he. Command wasn't impressed. The moment the data reached HQ, a colonel sent an order. "Cease all unauthorized modifications immediately." Mac laughed when he read it. "Too late," he said. "The future already heard us coming." He'd crossed the red line and proved it could be done. From that day forward, every Thunderbolt in the group carried a quiet nickname carved under the canopy rail: Mac Boost, and no one talked about it out loud. Mac's band fix was genius disguised as recklessness, and danger measured in seconds. Every man in the 366th Fighter Group now knew what his toggle switch could do. But no one wanted to admit they used it. It wasn't an upgrade, it was a gamble with physics. To understand what Mac had done, you had to understand the delicate dance between fuel, air, and heat. The Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger was designed to deliver controlled boost. Exhaust gases drove a turbine, which forced compressed air into the engine cylinders. The system worked beautifully, until altitude turned it sluggish. At 30,000 feet, air density drops to 1/3 of what it is at sea level. The turbo needed to spin nearly twice as fast just to maintain the same oxygen flow. The official regulator kept that from happening to prevent overboost, an engine's death sentence. Mac deleted the safety net. By bypassing the altitude compensating relay, he created a condition where the turbo continued spooling past its factory limit. The boost curve didn't flatten, it shot upward. The manifold pressure jumped from 45 to 58 inches of mercury. That meant a 22% increase in oxygen density inside the combustion chamber, which in turn spiked horsepower by over 200 at high altitude. It also pushed exhaust temperatures into the danger zone, over 1,600 degrees hotter than the engine metal was rated to withstand. The turbo's turbine blades, made from high chromium steel, began glowing orange during test runs. Mechanics called it Hellfire Boost. One slip 1 second too long on the toggle, and the engine wouldn't just stall, it would detonate. But Mac didn't care. His logic was brutally simple. Better to risk burning an engine than burning a pilot. In war, time was measured in bursts of combat. A Thunderbolt didn't need to survive for years. It needed to survive one fight. Mac's fix gave pilots a temporary weapon: 5 minutes of godlike power. It was, as one flight log later described it, like riding a lightning bolt. Command hated it. Engineers from right field called the MOD thermodynamic suicide. But when combat reports rolled in showing Thunderbolts climbing faster and living longer in jet encounters, the data spoke louder than orders. Analysis from captured gun camera footage proved it. The MOD worked. Climb rate: plus 800 feet per minute over standard at 28,000 feet. Airspeed gain: plus 22 kmph sustained for 4 minutes before thermal fade. Engine life: reduced by 40%, but pilot survival increased by 70%. That was the trade. Mechanics whispered about it like a myth. Mac's curve. The fine line between mastery and meltdown. Even pilots who never met him started asking their ground crews, "Can you give me the Mac fix?" By April 1945, the modification had spread across at least 6 Thunderbolt groups in the 9th Air Force. No one ever wrote it down, no one ever reported it. But the results were visible in the sky. P-47s now meeting Me-262s at altitude and living to tell the story. Every time a pilot returned from a mission with a melted manifold and a grin, Mac knew his gamble was paying off. He used to say, "You can't win wars by playing fair with machines. You gotta make them scared of you." And in that moment, when piston fighters began outrunning the jet age, even for a few seconds, fear changed sides. March 7th, 1945. Dawn over western Germany. The air shimmered silver with frost and exhaust haze. The mission sounded simple: escort bombers across the Rhine, clear the corridor, and return. But every pilot in the ready tent knew what the real threat was. The Me-262s from Lechfeld and Rhine, fast enough to make even Thunderbolts look ancient. Lieutenant Dale Heston adjusted his flight gloves as the ground crew finished topping off the tanks. His P-47, tail number 278401, still smelled like burnt oil from the last test flight. The engine cowling bore fresh streaks of scorched paint where Mac's banned fix had nearly melted through the night before. "You sure this thing won't blow up?" Heston asked, grinning nervously. Mac, standing in his oil-stained jacket, shrugged. "She'll either fly or teach us how not to. Don't forget the switch. Only when you've got no other choice." At 0900, the formation climbed into the pale light, contrails snaking eastward. At 25,000 feet, Heston's wingman, Lieutenant Carver, called out, "Contact 11 o'clock high, 2 bogeys, maybe more." Then came the radio crackle everyone dreaded. "Bandits confirmed. Jets." 2 Me-262s, sleek and metallic, diving from the sun. They weren't just faster, they were from the future. One broke off toward the bomber stream, the other lined up on Heston's tail. The air filled with the staccato roar of 30mm cannons. The first burst missed by yards, tracers streaking past the canopy. Heston pulled hard into a climb, feeling the G's crush his chest. The thunderbolt strained. 27,000 feet. 29,000. The engine coughing at the edge of its limit. The Me-262 was right behind him, closing fast. "Mac," he whispered under his breath. "Hope you're right." He flipped the hidden toggle. The world changed sound. The engine bellowed like thunder, cracking through steel. The manifold gauge jumped, 54 inches, 56, 58. The turbo screamed, glowing orange in the cold air. The jug surged upward with impossible force. "Jesus, it's holding!" Heston shouted. The Me-262 pilot, expecting an easy kill, suddenly found himself chasing something accelerating away. The Thunderbolt's tail shimmered with heat distortion as it rocketed past 30,000 feet, contrails tearing apart in its wake. The jet fired one last burst, missed, and banked away. Its twin turbines weren't built for sharp turns at that altitude. By the time it corrected, the P-47 had vanished into the haze. Heston leveled off at 31,000 feet, engine temperature in the red, boost still pegged high. The altimeter spun slower now. The climb was over, but the chase was done. Radio silence filled the channel. Then from Carver's voice, "Holy hell. Red 2, did you just outrun a jet?" Heston could hardly breathe. "Guess so," he said between gasps. "Guess we can stop running." When he landed, the engine was half melted. The turbo casing had cracked and the copper bypass wire was fused into the manifold. Mechanics stared like they were looking at a ghost. The squadron commander arrived minutes later, jaw tight. "You disobeyed standing orders," he said. "You should have been shot out of the sky." Heston grinned. "Sir, I was trying." Mac stood off to the side, silent. He knew the colonel wouldn't understand what that fix had meant. That for 9 minutes, a piston fighter had defied the future. That a handful of wire, instinct, and defiance had closed the so-called jet gap. Later, when the combat footage was analyzed, intelligence confirmed the impossible. The Me-262's pilot had broken off at over 560 mph, still slower than the Thunderbolt's recorded top speed that day. The report ended with a single line typed in disbelief. "Pilot exceeded aircraft performance envelope. Cause unknown modification." Mac kept that line pinned above his workbench for the rest of the war. 2 days after the jet intercept, the hangar doors at St. Trond Airfield groaned open to reveal the most famous P-47 in Europe. Heston's black-scorched jug, still dripping oil onto the frozen mud. Mechanics stood in a half-circle around it like witnesses at a crime scene. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. Colonel Robert Hard Rule Leland, commander of the 366th Fighter Group, marched across the hangar floor with a clipboard and a face like thunder. He stopped at the wrecked engine cowling and glared at Mac. "Is this your handiwork, Sergeant?" Mac wiped his hands on a rag. "She flew home, didn't she?" "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters, sir." Leland's jaw tightened. "You rewired a turbo governor, bypassed altitude regulation, and tampered with an Air Corps certified power plant." Do you understand that's not field modification? That's sabotage by definition? The hangar went dead quiet. Pilots looked away. Even the junior mechanics froze mid-motion. Mac met his eyes without blinking. If it's sabotage, it's the kind that saves pilots. You like your men coming home, or do you like your paperwork clean? Leland's voice dropped. You could be court-martialed for that. Before Mac could answer, the side door slammed open. Lieutenant Heston stormed in, still wearing his flight jacket, holding a rolled-up mission report. "Colonel," he said, "before you hang him, you might want to read this." He tossed the paper on the desk. It was the after-action summary from 8th Air Force HQ. It confirmed that during the March 7th mission, the ME-262 had been shot down by a trailing P-51, mere seconds after Heston's Thunderbolt had drawn it off the bomber formation. Leland frowned. "That doesn't prove," Heston cut him off. "It proves that Fix saved 40 bombers and 200 men. The ME-262 that would have slaughtered them chased me instead, because my plane could climb." The colonel looked at the report again, then at Mac, then back at the jug, its cracked manifolds, melted wiring, the charred toggle switch half hidden beneath the seat. He sighed, the kind of sigh that comes when anger gives way to reluctant respect. "You realize," he said quietly, "if this gets out, every idiot in Europe will try your stunt and blow himself to bits." Mac's lips curled. "Then you'd better not let it get out." The colonel stared at him for a long time, then tore the report in half. "As far as this group is concerned, that fix never happened. That flight was standard procedure. That engine malfunctioned, understood?" Heston saluted, suppressing a grin. "Crystal clear, sir." The colonel turned to leave, muttering under his breath, "Damn mechanics got more brass than half my pilots." When he was gone, Heston clapped Mac on the shoulder. "You just won a fight without firing a shot," Mac smirked. "Good. I'm better with wrenches than bullets." Word spread fast, faster than any memo could stop it. Across the front, other Thunderbolt units began quietly copying Mac's curve. Pilots whispered to their crew chiefs, "Add the switch." No one wrote it down. No one reported it. But suddenly, more P-47s were making it home from jet encounters. Within weeks, headquarters noticed a pattern. Turbo failures up 60%, but kill-to-loss ratios improving across all modified groups. The Air Technical Service Command sent investigators to review field practices. They found nothing, officially. Unofficially, every mechanic they spoke to said the same thing: don't ask about the wire. After the war, engineers at Wright Field examined surviving field aircraft and found traces of unauthorized circuitry inside the turbo governors. Their post-war report labeled it Field Expedient Power Enhancement, Unidentified Origin. The name of the originator was never written. But every Thunderbolt pilot who lived through that spring knew it, and they never forgot the man who taught them that survival was worth breaking the rules for. In his bunk that night, Mac wrote one line in his notebook before lights out. "Paper says I broke an engine. Truth is, I bent the sky." By April 1945, Mac McAllister had become a ghost story told in hangars, half mechanic, half magician. Pilots whispered his name like a superstition. "Mac Boost," they'd say, touching the throttle before takeoff. "Keep me alive today." No one knew if he still tinkered in secret, or if his commanding officers had finally ordered him to stop. But every P-47 that climbed faster than it should have, every jug that came back from the edge of the jet age, carried his fingerprints somewhere deep inside its wiring. The numbers didn't lie, even when the reports did. In February, the average Thunderbolt loss ratio was 1 aircraft lost for every 3 enemy encounters. In April, after the field modifications, that number dropped to 1 in 9. Bomber losses to jet interception fell by 40% in the same period. Command refused to admit the connection, but the pilots knew. The official report said, Engine performance irregularities observed. The unofficial report said, "Whatever he did, it works." That was the math of defiance, the arithmetic of men who refused to accept that progress belonged to the enemy. While the Germans worshipped precision, the Americans weaponized improvisation. Where the Reich built perfect machines in perfect factories, men like Mack turned mud, wire, and desperation into victory. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. In a war defined by assembly lines, he represented something older, rawer, a return to the craftsman's instinct, the farm boy's stubborn logic that you fix what's broken, even if it means breaking something else first. Historians would later write that the Allies won the air war through production and logistics. But those statistics hid the truth. Production meant nothing if the machines didn't perform when they mattered most. It took one grease-stained sergeant working by lantern light in a frozen hangar to prove that innovation doesn't come from labs. It comes from men with no time left to wait for permission. When post-war engineers at Wright Field studied captured German jets, they realized something profound. For all their speed, the Me-262s were fragile, temperamental, underpowered at altitude, prone to flame out. The P-47, with its brute strength and redundant systems, could survive almost anything. Mack's fix had made it do something no one thought possible. Outrun the future, if only for a minute. In those few minutes, everything changed. The line between piston and jet blurred. The myth of German invincibility cracked. And in that narrow window between fire and flight, the Thunderbolt proved that ingenuity could still outrun innovation. After the war, when the Air Force quietly reviewed unauthorized field modifications, the memo concluded with one sentence that would have made Mack smile. Certain alterations demonstrated unexpected potential for high-altitude boost efficiency. Recommendation: study similar systems for next-generation aircraft. They never mentioned his name. They didn't have to, because every pilot who felt the engine roar past its limit, every mechanic who dared turn one more screw beyond the manual's red line, was part of his legacy. The future came early, and it came wired together by a man who believed no rule could stop a machine that still wanted to fight. In the summer of 1945, when the guns went silent and the airfields filled with weeds, Arthur "Mack" McAllister stayed behind to pack up what was left of his war. The Thunderbolts were being hauled away, stripped for parts or shipped home. The hangars that had once buzzed with engines and adrenaline now echoed with quiet, the kind that only men who've outlived their machines understand. He walked one last time along the row of grounded fighters, running his hand over their scorched aluminum skins, the faded nose art, the ghostly residue of exhaust around the cowling. On the side of Heston's old jug, someone had painted a single phrase in chipped black letters: "Mack's fix." He smiled at that. Then, without ceremony, he pulled the toggle switch from its cockpit, the same little lever that had changed the math of the sky, and slipped it into his pocket. "That one's mine," he said. Back home in Iowa, peace felt unnatural. The quiet fields that once inspired his understanding of engines now felt like a vacuum. He opened a small auto shop outside Cedar Rapids, where farmers brought in their tractors, combines, and sometimes old warplanes with grass growing through their fuselages. He'd fix them all, humming to himself, cigarette dangling from his lips, always muttering the same mantra: "Engines don't quit, people do." Years passed. The world moved on to jets, then missiles. When the Korean War came, his old students, now Air Force engineers, carried versions of his wiring logic into new designs. The F-86 Saber's high-altitude turbo control bore a quiet resemblance to his forbidden bypass circuit. Officially, it came from advanced airflow studies. Unofficially, it came from a muddy hangar in France. One day in the early 1960s, a journalist from an aviation magazine tracked him down. He found Mack in a greasy jumpsuit, working on a broken harvester. "You're the man who made the Thunderbolt outrun a jet," the reporter said. "You realize you changed the future." Mack chuckled, not looking up. Nah, he said, tightening a bolt. I just helped it show up on time. The reporter asked him if he'd do it again, risk his career, break every rule, to make a plane fly faster than it should. Mac wiped his hands, looked at the horizon, and said, "Every damn time." When he died in 1971, the local paper printed one paragraph. Arthur McAllister, 54, mechanic and war veteran, known for his work on World War II aircraft, passed quietly at his home. He is survived by 2 sons and a legend that never made the manuals. But years later, at an air show in Texas, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt performed a high-speed climb that left even modern pilots speechless. Its placard read, "Dedicated to the man who rewired the sky." Somewhere above the clouds, maybe, he'd have smiled. Because the man who bent the rules had outlived them, and in doing so proved that courage isn't always the one pulling the trigger. Sometimes it's the one holding the wrench.